the summer Ruthie Doss turned 9 in Prairie County, Nebraska. The bank sent a man out in a clean white pickup to look at the 100 acres her grandfather had just bought. And he stood at the fence line, shaking his head, before he ever got back in his truck. Ruthie wasn't planting a garden. She wasn't building anything strange. She was walking 6 small goats out onto ground the bank itself had called dry and worthless for 11 straight years. If stories of quiet determination, family, and the wisdom hidden in ordinary places move you, subscribe and join us every day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you'd like to go deeper into stories like this one, we've got an ebook waiting for you in the description below. Ruthie's grandfather, Frank Doss, had farmed corn and beans on the home place for better than 30 years. But 1983 had been unkind to nearly every farmer in Prairie County. Interest rates climbing past 18%, corn prices sitting flat. And Frank had watched 2 neighbors lose their places to the same bank that now held his own note. What Frank wanted, more than anything else that hard summer, was a small patch of ground close to the house where his granddaughter could keep a few goats of her own, something simple in hers, in a year when very little else on the farm felt certain. Ruthie's mother had passed 2 winters before, and her father worked the rail line out of Grand Island most weeks, which meant Ruthie spent the better part of her days on the Doss home place with Frank. The 2 of them settling into a rhythm that suited them both better than either had expected. Frank wasn't a man who talked a great deal, but he'd taken to including Ruthie in the actual work of the farm rather than keeping her at the edges of it. And by 9 years old, she could already read a fence line for weak spots and tell a healthy stand of alfalfa from one that needed rain worse than the rest. The 100 acres came up at a tax sale that June, land the county had carried on its books for 11 years after the previous owner walked away from it. And the bank's own appraiser had stamped it dry, rocky, and not worth the taxes owed against it. Frank went to that sale anyway, with what savings he had left after a rough spring, and came home the owner of 100 acres nobody else in Prairie County had bid on. The land itself did look rough at first pass. A thin skin of grass over hardpan clay, a stand of scrub cedar along the north fence, and not a single visible pond, spring or drainage anywhere across the whole stretch. The county records showed 2 dry test holes drilled back in the 50s, both abandoned at 60 and 80 feet without hitting anything worth pumping. And that history alone was enough to keep every other buyer away for over a decade. Frank didn't buy it expecting to find water. He bought it because it was cheap enough to afford, close enough to walk to from the house, and because Ruthie had been asking for a place to keep goats since she was 7 years old. Ever since a Sunday school friend's family had let her bottle feed a kid one spring. He fenced off 20 of the 100 acres with second-hand wire and old cedar posts pulled from a torn-down corral, and Ruthie picked out 6 goats at the sale barn that same week, 3 does and 3 wethers. With money she'd saved herself from selling eggs door to door for 2 summers running. The bankman who came out that first week wasn't there about the goats specifically. He was there because the bank still held paper on Frank's home place, and word had gotten around town that Frank had spent his own cash, real cash, on ground. But the bank had been trying to write off its books for over a decade. He stood at the fence, looked at the thin grass and the scrub cedar, and told Frank plainly that he hoped the girl enjoyed her goats because that 100 acres wasn't going to do the family any good beyond that. "You know what's under that ground, Frank?" the bankman said, tapping the hood of his truck. "Nothing. County drilled it twice back in 54, 56, dry both times. We've had it on the books 11 years because nobody in 3 counties would touch it." Frank didn't argue with him. He'd seen the same county records himself before the sale, and he hadn't bought the land expecting to prove the bank wrong about the water. He'd bought it because it was cheap enough to afford on what little cash he had left, and because Ruthie needed somewhere of her own. Ruthie didn't much care what the bank man thought. She walked her 6 goats out onto that ground nearly every morning that summer, moving the fence a little at a time the way her grandfather showed her, letting them work through one patch of grass and cedar brush before moving to the next. It wasn't scientific. It was mostly a 9-year-old girl and 6 goats figuring out 100 acres together, one section at a time, through the hottest months Prairie County had seen in years. By July, Ruthie had noticed something she couldn't quite explain. Her goats, given the whole fence 20 acres to range across, kept drifting back to the same low corner near the cedar stand, a spot no different to look at than the ground around it, and standing there, pawing at the clay with their front hooves in a way she hadn't seen them do anywhere else on the property. She mentioned it to her grandfather more than once, and Frank, busy with his own corn crop and a banknote weighing on him, mostly told her that goats were curious animals and probably just like the shade under the cedars. That summer was one of the driest Prairie County had seen in years, the kind of heat that cracked open ground that had never cracked before and turned even established pasture brittle and pale by early July. Ruthie's own attempt at a small vegetable patch near the fence line failed within the first month, the soil there baking hard as brick despite her hauling water to it most evenings after chores. A real disappointment for a 9-year-old who'd been proud of the seeds she'd picked out herself at the feed store. It was that same failed garden, oddly enough, that first got her paying closer attention to which parts of the property seemed to hold moisture at all, and which didn't. It took until August, and a good deal more insistence from Ruthie than most grown men would have tolerated from a 9-year-old, before Frank finally walked out to that corner himself one evening and watched the goats do exactly what Ruthie had described. Even in the day's worst heat, with every other patch of ground on the property baked hard and pale, the clay in that one low corner stayed a shade darker, cooler under his boot, and the goats kept returning to paw at it like they were looking for something specific rather than simply resting in the shade. Frank had drilled enough wells in his life to recognize what he was looking at, even if he didn't fully trust it yet. Dark, cool, slightly softer ground in the middle of a drought, summer usually meant moisture rising from somewhere below. Even where 2 previous test holes, drilled decades earlier and a good distance away, had come up dry. He called a well driller out of the next county the following week, an old acquaintance named Curtis Boone, who drilled half the wells in that part of Nebraska and who came out mostly as a favor rather than any real expectation of finding something the county's own record said wasn't there. The first pass wasn't a clean success either. Curtis set his rig up directly over the spot Ruthie had marked with a fence stake and drilled to 40 feet without hitting anything worth mentioning, just the same dry clay and shale the old test holes had reported. Frank nearly called it off right there, unwilling to spend more on a well that was looking like it might confirm the bank's appraisal after all. It was Curtis who suggested moving the rig 20 feet closer to the cedar stand itself, reading the tree line's own root pattern as a better indicator than the exact spot the goats had pawed at, since cedar roots in that region tend to chase moisture more reliably than any single test hole ever could. That second hole hit water at 60 feet. A real vein, flowing at a rate Curtis said was better than most producing wells he drilled in Prairie County that whole decade. It wasn't a lake underground, and it wasn't going to make anyone rich overnight. But it was enough water, tested and confirmed over the following weeks, to run a real herd of livestock and irrigate a genuine garden plot. On ground the bank's own paperwork had called dry for 11 straight years. Curtis ran the numbers twice before he'd fully believe them himself, checking the flow rate against a chart he kept folded in his glove box, and told Frank he'd be glad to put his own name on the report if the county ever asked to see it. Word moved through Prairie County about as fast as anything ever did there. Neighbors who'd driven past that 100 acres for 11 years without a second thought suddenly found reasons to slow down along the county road. And more than a few stopped in at the feed store specifically to ask Frank whether the rumor was true. The same bank man who'd stood at Frank's fence line that first week came back out in September. And this time, he didn't say much of anything at all. Just stood a while looking at the new pump housing and the trough Frank had built for both the goats and, come spring, whatever cattle he decided to add back onto that ground. Curtis Boone, for his part, told anyone who asked that he'd drilled wells across 4 counties for the better part of 20 years and couldn't remember another one that owed its location to a 9-year-old's goats rather than his own equipment or geological survey. He came back out the following spring on his own time just to see how the well was holding up, and told Frank the flow rate hadn't dropped an inch since the first test, a good sign for a well that deep in that particular clay. Frank never asked the bank man for an apology, and never got one directly. But the bank's own valuation on that 100 acres changed considerably by the time the next tax assessment came around. And the same officer who'd once called the ground worthless was the one who eventually approved Frank's request for a small loan to fence the rest of the property and run a proper line out to a second trough. Ruthie kept her 6 goats on that ground through the following spring and every spring after, the herd growing slowly as she saved and reinvested the way she had from the very start. She was the one, more than her grandfather or the driller he'd called, who first noticed the ground behaving differently, who kept pointing it out long after a grown man might have stopped mentioning it, and who was there watching the day Curtis Boone's second hole finally came up wet. George Washington Carver, who spent much of his working life teaching Southern farmers to read their own soil rather than simply working it, once said that when you do the common things in life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. Ruthie never read those words, and likely never heard Carver's name spoken in Prairie County. But she'd done exactly that, walking the same 100 acres every morning with the same 6 goats, paying closer attention than anyone older than her had thought to, until the ground itself finally told her what it had been holding on to for 11 quiet years. What's a piece of advice or a hard season in your own life that turned out, in the end, to be exactly what you needed, even when it didn't look that way at the time? Tell us in the comments below. And if these stories of quiet persistence and country wisdom mean something to you, subscribe and join us every day for a new one. And if you'd like to go deeper into the kind of forgotten, practical wisdom this story's built on, we've put together a full collection of it, and you'll find it waiting for you in the description below.